As the humanitarian crisis in Syria deepens, the international community must decide whether it should intervene to protect innocent civilians or if military action will do more harm than good. To talk us through the legal situation, I'm joined now by Gerry Simpson, a Professor of International Law at Melbourne University. Gerry, good morning. More horrific images out of Syria today, blood-stained sheets and blankets and bodies lying in rows, but still the prospect of international military intervention, some sort of military intervention, is basically zero.
Well, it doesn't look very likely. I suppose the Security Council has three options at the moment. One is to somehow beef up the monitoring mission that's already there. There are some 300 UN monitors. I'm not sure exactly what they're doing there or whether they're able to prevent these sorts of massacres in the future. It seems very likely given the numbers in Syria. The second possibility, of course, is to apply sanctions to the Syrian regime. There seems to be some resistance to that on the part of the Russians in particular. And then I suppose the third option would be a full-scale military intervention authorized by the Security Council of the sort we saw in relation to, say, Libya last year and previous interventions, say, in Iraq in 1991. So those are the three options. And I must say the military intervention seems unlikely and not altogether feasible, according to some military experts.
Does this talk today of the possible movement of chemical weapons in Syria change that at all?
Well, I suppose it might induce some panic in the Security Council, especially amongst the Western powers. But it seems it's a familiar scenario, claiming that an Arab state is likely to use chemical weapons. We heard it in Iraq, and as we know, there are a number of scare stories coming out of Iran. So this seems to me to be rather familiar, and I would need to hear more sort of credible reports before taking it completely seriously.
So in terms of the options you spelt out there, the first one was beefing up the monitoring mission. To what extent would that really address the problems there anyway?
Well, Syria is a big country, and there are only 300 monitors there at the moment, so it would require a really large peacekeeping operation, what we might think of almost as peace building, where a large number of UN monitors, UN peace-building troops, possibly even accompanied by police, would enter Syria with the permission of the Syrian government and engage in peacekeeping. But it's hard to know how peacekeeping would work in a situation as fluid as the one that exists in Syria today. This isn't, after all, a conventional civil war, the sort we see, or we saw, for example, in Cyprus, where you insert peacekeepers between the two warring parties. Syria is nothing like this. I mean, even if we describe it as a civil war rather than a humanitarian crisis, it's a rather unusual sort of civil war. It's not clear that there are simply two sides in this civil war. The whole situation is very confused and fragmented.
Just on that point briefly, I know there are New Zealanders as part of that monitoring mission there at the moment in Syria, but as I understand, there are no Australians. Do you know why that's the case?
I've got no idea why the Australians aren't there. I mean,
is that a little curious?
New Zealand has historically played a pretty large role in peacekeeping operations, as far as I understand, sometimes a larger role than Australia, but I don't know why Australian forces aren't there at the moment.
Okay, your second option there for the international community was applying sanctions to the regime. What sanctions are already in place and how could they be ratcheted up?
Well, I think the problem with sanctions is that the Russian government is very close to Syria, and it does look as if, both in the case of a possible extension of the sanctions regime, a possible military intervention, that Russia will either call for a watered-down resolution of some sort, and the Russians drafted a resolution recently which was very, very diluted, or will veto a very strong resolution, either applying hard sanctions or indeed attempting to authorize military force. Of course, that doesn't stop an intervention altogether. After all, Russia said it would veto any intervention in Kosovo, and of course Russia, China and France were against intervention by the Security Council in Iraq in 2003, but in both cases, of course, either NATO forces in the case of Kosovo or the US and the UK went to war anyway.
So the grim reality is that this is likely to continue along the same lines as we've seen now until Bashar al-Assad crushes the opposition once and for all.
Well, or until forces within Syria remove Assad himself, and it's likely to be forces around Assad. I mean, it's likely to be members of the elite in this case. It seems,
and there have been a few indications of that so far?
Well, there have been the odd defection. It's hard to know. These things can move quite quickly. I mean, again, looking back to the situation in Libya, you saw some early defections from the regime, which undoubtedly destabilized the regime. It's possible in the case of Syria, but not terribly likely at this point.